The United States had quietly become the world's largest jailer, the highest percentage of people incarcerated. We're a democracy. I love our system of government. I love our system. And yet I had came to the conclusion, and I certainly wasn't the first, that we had failed in many ways, that we were not made safer by having 2.5 million people incarcerated, and what could be done about it. Having said that, I think we could save millions of lives if we altered our dietary guidelines. I'll show my hand, and got rid of sugars to start with. I would say we write about injustice, and we've had laws change, we've had regulations change, we've had innocent people who had been incarcerated freed as the result of our journalism. But you're right. I feel that truth telling, if it's done honestly and well, big if, is the most powerful way to affect change.
Neil, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Bob.
There are a whole lot of problems in the world. There are a whole lot of problems in our country.
Yeah.
Economics problems, political problems. Yet throughout history, we've had problems and we've been able to overcome them. One of the secrets to success is likely that we have been a truth-seeking society. And one of the things that marks your career is the ability to find truth, expose it, and gain some support for a popular movement to change it. At least your career, your last two endeavors are taking on projects like that. I'd love to talk about the process of that. Your prison, the identification of the prison system as a problem in the United States is interesting because it came from no background at all in the prison world. And
thankfully,
as you pointed out in the past, little reason to think that you would have ever come across something like that. And yet you were able to have some success. I'd love to talk about that, and then your most recent endeavor, and your thoughts in general about the ability to pursue truth and whether that's damaged at all.
Well, great. Thank you, Bob. I don't know if your viewers know this, but you and I are old colleagues and friends dating back from our financial careers, back 20 years now, I think, or more. So it's really great to catch up with you and to see what you're doing now in this latest project. So I salute you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you.
For background, as you know, Bob, I started life as a newspaper reporter. I was dedicated to, this was in pretty much the 80s, 90s, early 90s, changing the world, exposing the world. And I was at the Wall Street Journal. And for most of my journalism career, I covered Donald Trump, covered real estate, and then went to finance and had a career. Retired in 2009 and had The World Was My Oyster. And I had concluded in 2009, I did a film along the way. I did a documentary on the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch. And along the way, I had realized that, when you're in finance and you're managing a hedge fund, which I was doing, you are in a hole. You are in a cave. The world, it's relevant insofar as it's relevant to your business, but it's very hard to engage in the world on a daily basis. And I'll just tell you this small anecdote. I remember in 1995, 96, I read about a massacre that had happened in Serbia during the war and the breakup of Yugoslavia with the Serbians. And I didn't know about it when it was happening. And I said, how did I miss that? How do you miss this tragedy? And it's because I was so focused on my work, which you have to be sometimes. So I'm not beating myself up, but I felt like I needed to engage with the world. And around 2010, 2011, I started just reacquainting myself with what had been going on. And I'd read books on mass incarceration. I concluded, and as you and your viewers probably know, the United States had quietly become the world's largest jailer, the highest percentage of people incarcerated.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com.
You know, we're a democracy. I love our system of government. I love our system. And yet I had came to the conclusion, and I certainly wasn't the first, that we had failed in many ways, that you know, we were not made safer by having 2.5 million people incarcerated, and what could be done about it. That was my sort of question. And yes, I started something called the Marshall Project, which is a journalism organization that covers criminal justice. It's nonpartisan. I reached out to Bill Keller, who had been the editor of the New York Times, and he became our editor. And subsequently, we have 80 people, and we've won 2 Pulitzers, simply because I concluded that we needed to elevate the issue to one of national urgency. And the best way of doing that was through shining a light, truth-telling, storytelling, as you said. And, you know, there's controversy in criminal justice, obviously. How punishing should we be? What should people's responsibility be? And I'm not saying I have the answers, and I'm not saying it's always obvious. What is prison for? Is it for retribution? Is it for public safety? I mean, these are open issues, and I'm not, I do have my opinions, but I don't believe that they're with all and end all. But I do think this is an issue that we needed to talk about. And I had this dream literally in 2014, like, what if a question about criminal justice was in the presidential debates? That's how far away that was from the national conversation. Things have moved forward. I think everybody's familiar with these basic issues now. There has been backlash. You know, as soon as you have a spike in crime, people get frightened. They get more unwilling to take risk, and that's understandable. We've learned a lot through social science. Anyway, so that's what I did for about 5 years. I mean, I was a chairman in the Marshall Project, I think from 2014 or 15 through 2021. And then I stepped down to pursue other things. And I still do business, and I still do a few other stuff. But that was along the lines of your thesis. Yes, I felt we had an issue in society. We could do better. And in this case, I felt journalism was a great way to elevate it to a matter of national urgency.
Well, and most fascinating about it is that you were not taking this on as an advocate. You were taking on the project of exposing and letting the advocates
That's true.
be self-motivated.
However, if you scratch me, I have opinions. I feel journalism is most effective when it is not advocacy journalism, when it is truth discovery. Now, you can argue what is really objective and what is really truth and all that, but personally, I have my own views. But and I felt that I could get my views across best through journalism. The Marshall Project doesn't have an opinion on the death penalty. It doesn't have an opinion about, you know, mandatory sentencing. But we write about things, and often I would say we write about injustice, and we've had laws changed, we've had regulations change, we've had innocent people who had been incarcerated freed as the result of our journalism. But you're right. I feel that truth telling, if it's done honestly and well, big if, is the most powerful way to affect change. Yes.
One of the things that a lot of people complain about, and it's easy to wonder about, is over the last decade, there seems to be exposure of truth, and yet large sections of the public ignore it or don't think that it matters.
Well, I mean, that's such a long conversation. I would say we have had a deinstitutionalization of media in our country. In other words, when Walter Cronkite, the anchor at CBS News, went on TV in the old days and talked about Vietnam or talked about anything, he came with a certain amount of credibility, as did all the networks. It was before that we had fragmented. It was before social media. It was before AI, where you can manufacture videos. It was before, I would argue, Fox News. Somebody else might argue something else, but I would say that in the old days, we were an institutional society. Our churches, our universities, our networks, our newspapers, our big city newspapers, which were the anchor of every city in the country, where I would argue you could rely on for accurate. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. And I think, yes, there's been an unraveling and a fragmenting of institutions in general, including the media. which itself is fragmented because the business has collapsed, because we have siloed ourselves. Cable television to begin with, that you could just watch a food channel and you can watch a sports channel and you can watch a news channel. This has also separated us. It's innovation and it's progress in many ways, but I think and on some level, yeah, I think there is less trust of institutions than there was, and that includes the media, and especially the media.
I think it's symbiotic. There was a respect for media institutions when there were few of them, and there was a sense of responsibility in those organizations to address problems that could be consumed by the broad public rather than by a narrow audience for the economic survival of the media company.
Right.
And as the fragmentation happened, I think both of those started eroding. The respect for the few institutions who were offering up their view of the news eroded as those institutions had to continue to focus on narrower and narrower audiences. And I think that's probably a lot of explains some of the fragmentation of the media.
Definitely true in TV. But in any case, I am still here. You and I are on the same page. I am still an optimist. I'm a believer. I do believe that the vast majority of Americans and people in general are not haters. When they're confronted with truths about other people's lives, they have compassion and empathy. They're not ideologues. They are Democrats, small d. In other words, I think we all, and I think, and we'll find out soon, but I think at the end of the day, most people honor the humanity of other people, irrespective of race, creed, etc. That's my guiding light. It
happens to be mine too, which
it's just proven, and we have 2 steps back, 3 steps forward. Yes. And in fact, often we do go backwards, and you can argue things happening in other parts of the world now are horrific, and we've had this before. And that's the irony, that, technologically we're so far advanced, and knowledge-wise we're so far advanced, and yet we haven't cured our mistakes. We haven't cured our propensity to hate, to demonize. So, we can't solve that now. But I would say the Marshall Project has done a good job of raising awareness and making people, force people to debate the issue of criminal justice, public safety, mass incarceration in America, and I'm very proud of it.
Well,
and I've moved on.
You really should be, because the prison system has evolved, and there are plenty of reforms that have occurred. And in any reform effort, you're going to get situations that are controversial with parts of the public. But the general idea that the incarceration rate in the U.S., which was, as I remember, 4 times when you started the project, it was 4 times larger than anybody else. Or, well, do you remember the stats?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I don't remember the numbers, but we had about 2.3 million people incarcerated on a percentage of population. I think that was the highest. Saudi Arabia was giving us a run for our money. In raw numbers, I think China was more, but they have a higher population. And now I think that
North Korea was up there too, right?
Who?
North Korea.
Probably, yeah. But, this is not a company you want to keep in general. And now the rate of incarceration has gone down. Crime, believe it or not, you wouldn't know it, but has dropped in virtually every category. It peaked again in COVID. It spiked. It didn't peak. It spiked again in COVID. Murders are down. Violent crimes are down. Rapes are down. Certain kinds of burglaries are up. I mean, nationally. And if you look at the homicide rates in big cities in the last 3 years, they're plummeting.
Yeah.
And, and guess why that is? We don't know. One of the great, we saw in New York City, where I live and where I am immersed, we saw a 25-year decline in crime. New York had become the most safe big city in the world. And a lot of that was policing. A lot of it was probably, a lot of that was demographics, probably. A lot of that was technology, probably. A lot of that was the economy, probably. But do we really know?
We do not really know.
And then COVID, I think, it definitely spiked. There was, there was anomie and disorientation and anxiety and economic stress. And now it's dropping again. So I would love, and I think it's very hard to implement and or advocate for reform when crime is up. It takes one graphic crime or murder for people to say, that's it, lock them up. So, and I've learned a lot since then because there has been a backlash and people are resistant to reform if they're fearful. And fear is a very human emotion. I lived in New York my whole life. I raised my kids here. I never felt unsafe. I have maybe a higher tolerance for certain things than other people do, but my feelings aren't really the determining factor in policy, unfortunately. So you have to sort of understand where the public is and things like that. But I would say that in general, we're a smarter, better society today about this than we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago when the Marshall Project started.
How about your latest project? Tell us about that and how you came across.
Well, my latest, I have about 3 years ago, during COVID, actually, I had I'm a healthy guy. I'm 66. What you see is I was probably 15, 20 pounds heavier at my peak. But in general, I'm not an exercise freak, but I rarely saw the inside of a doctor's office. Very lucky, knock wood. And then during COVID, everything happened. Everything hit the fan. I got a little infection in my pinky. It's called a paronychia. It didn't go away, which was a sign, by the way. Antibiotics didn't go away. It was a nagging, painful thing. Then I got pains in my stomach. They took a blood test, and they said I had Crohn's. And by the way, my blood sugar was elevated to 11.8 A1C, which is very, very high and very dangerous. I have then they diagnosed me with type 2 diabetes. And the next few weeks, I also got serious COVID, gout, and shingles. And every doctor I went to said, wow, you're having bad luck. I said, dude, you think maybe my immune system's, something's going on with my body? They go, no, bad luck. Because every doctor deals with his or her organ. So I'm like, oh my God. And the most serious was actually the diabetes, because if people know what diabetes is, it's when, not type 1 diabetes, where you don't manufacture insulin when you need insulin, otherwise you die. Type 2 is where your insulin doesn't really, where you have very high blood sugar. And because your insulin isn't properly taking your blood sugar into the organs where it's used as energy, and it accumulates, and all sorts of horrible things can happen. Neuropathy in your feet, eyes, don't ask. And 100,000 people. Anyway, so I was put on a very traditional regimen of drugs. I shot myself with insulin every day. I took metformin, which is a pill that lowers your blood sugar. And I chronicled it, and it was a real pain. And I started learning. And I came to realize that I could get rid of my diabetes or reverse it just through diet, through a low carb diet. I knew a little already. And I went on a basic, and my wife and I, we studied, and what's how many carbs are in avocado and how many carbs are in skim milk versus whole milk. Anyway, and I got past everything. I got rid of it. My A1C is normal. I'm asymptomatic in every way with diabetes. If I eat pizza every day or a bagel, or ice cream, it'll spike. And that's dangerous for me. But if I manage it by not eating carbohydrates like millions and millions of others, I can reverse my diabetes. So I wrote about that because I'm a big mouth and I like to write still. And I wrote about it for The Guardian, just my personal experience. And the feedback was amazing. This was in December 2023, or January, or December, November. Amazing response from the community of people who basically are fighting this fight. And so I decided that I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a scientist, but I am a journalist, and I do understand finance. So I endeavored to follow the money. Why is this? Why does the American Diabetes Association not recommend a low-carb diet? Why is their website like a supermarket for medical technology? And why are they even in their recipes recommending potatoes? Potatoes, which every doctor will tell you, it's a starch, it's a sugar. It gives you diabetes. Well, they took money for $200,000 from the Idaho Potato Association. Anyway, so I did a deep dive, and I'm continuing to, just on the basic for The Guardian. This series is called Death by Diabetes, America's Preventable Epidemic. And I'm looking at all the factors that go into why, despite amazing medical advancement and technology and drug development, why do more people have diabetes now? 5 times more than had it 30 years ago. Why are 100,000 people dying a year as opposed to 30,000 30 years ago? Why are we losing the war against this disease? And by the way, we're also doing against other chronic diseases like Alzheimer's and um, um, Crohn's, et cetera. But I'm focusing on diabetes because diabetes, clearly you can reverse through diet. So I did one article about just the American Diabetes, the first two about the American Diabetes Association, not bad people, but they're massively funded by the pharmaceutical and food industries. And I believe, people can debate, that they are heavily influenced by that money, and that the medical guidance they give, which is followed by doctors, is really, really bad for patients. And so I took them to task. The next issue I want to tackle is amputations, because about 100,000 people a year have limbs amputated because of diabetes, because they get infections in their feet, they get blisters and things, they lose feeling in their feet because the blood sugar has accumulated, and then they get infections. It's very sad and painful, and also sometimes fatal after their amputation. So I'm working now and reaching out to people, and I want to understand what their medical care was. What is their life like? I believe we started off talking about storytelling. I believe telling people stories is a powerful way to affect change. And this is not easy because you have to gain people's trust and you have to be sensitive to their privacy, and it's hard. But that's what I'm doing. And I have some other ideas up my sleeve to write about it. I think Congress should, well, here's the thing. We should have congressional hearings on nutrition. Our dietary guidelines, and you have family members who've looked at this, are horrible. They're dangerous. The problem is, as controversial as criminal justice is and race is, nutrition's more. Nutrition is the most divisive and polarizing issue I've ever encountered. Vegans versus carnivores, low fat versus low carb. I mean, you could go, and it's pitch battle. And so it's hard. And I have my views, but I'm shocked at how polarizing and adversarial the world is. Having said that, I think we could save millions of lives if we altered our dietary guidelines. I'll show my hand, and got rid of sugars to start with.
The food industry and the pharmaceutical industry almost working hand in hand without even needing to work hand in hand. But there are embedded interests that make it difficult
Yep.
for people to find and see the truth.
Yep.
And to respond to it.
Yep.
There are just, especially on the nutrition side, there are just deep-seated beliefs that are not based in medical reality
Yep.
that have taken over. I know some of this because my wife has done a lot of work in nutrition as a nutritionist, and it is interesting because there are, as you're going to find, I'm sure, and as you alluded to, there are many other medical afflictions that are treated by pharmaceuticals, and once the money starts,
Yep.
it's very difficult to stop this pushing of needs.
Yeah. A lot of this is also that nutritional science is hard because, first of all, the National Institute of Health, which funds much of the scientific research in our country, along with the pharmaceutical industry and universities, they're often looking for a blockbuster drug. And don't get me wrong, I have huge respect for pharmaceuticals and cancer. I mean, I have friends whose lives have been saved, and you may as well, and your listeners, from pharmaceuticals. So I am not unilaterally attacking the drug industry. However, yes, because there's this financial incentive, their allocation of resources is skewed towards pharma, and it's very hard to do dietary research because how do you get a control group? How do I know you're not smoking a cigarette while you're eating vegetables or, or bread? And so it's very hard because humans are human to have a randomized control trial for too long because there are all these, maybe you're living next to a coal mine or you're breathing unhealthy air, so it's hard to just get clean research. Not impossible, but it is hard and expensive.
Well, it's unbelievably complex, and that's a
Mhm.
contributing factor to what you're talking about. It's
Yeah.
you really can't and to zero in on one factor and prove anything may
Yeah.
be irrelevant once you introduce it into the complexity of all the other elements. One of the great examples of that is this new science on the microbiome, which
Yep.
is billions and billions of microbes that
Yep.
you can't even isolate them, and they actually have their own almost personality in how they treat and digest foods. And so it is extremely complex,
I'm
and
with you.
therefore it's very
Yeah.
difficult to get any kind of consensus and move in a general direction.
There's one thing I think there's a consensus on, which is cigarettes are bad for you. And there are even doctors who claim that that's not true. But in general, but for years, the sugar industry was funding research that showed that sugar was an empty calorie. Doesn't hurt you, doesn't help you. And for people with diabetes, that's crazy, but probably for all people, processed sugars is something that, I think there should be a consensus by now that is harmful and worse than harmful, it's addictive. One of the things about, in my experience, the low carb diet, which I'm on, and I do eat meat. I know that not everybody agrees about this, but I feel it has all the essential nutrients. It's very good for you and it's filling. And I think the key to dieting is satiety, being full. And if you just eat, people say, well, eat less and move more. That's BS because if you're hungry all day, you will not keep to that diet. And I've also come to believe, I haven't written about this yet, but that really we live in a society where there's a tremendous prejudice against overweight people. And nobody wants to be overweight. Or maybe some people do, but most people, they metabolize food differently. They have access to their access is different. And yet we demonize them and we blame them. And in diabetes, this is relevant because type 2 diabetes, which is known as the fat person's disease, is seen as a moral weakness, which also complicates things. So I'm just trying to deal with the easy stuff. And the easy stuff is diabetes, because clearly people with diabetes should not be eating carbohydrate-rich foods, period. Potato is a potato.
Whether there's an effective drug that can offset it or not, you shouldn't be doing it.
Right. And that's interesting. I'm not an expert in this at all. And so now people will ask me what I think of those drugs, and I don't really have what is your view of these GLP-1 inhibitors? And
I think my general view of drugs are that they're very effective, and in some cases they're not necessary. And
right.
so if they are not necessary, then the body should be taking care of its problems on its own because it strengthens the body. That's my general overall view. And I do think that the pharmaceutical industry is so motivated to make to put patients on their drugs to capture the third-party revenue that the individual doesn't, in most cases, even have to pay themselves, that you wind up with too many people on drugs that don't need to be on drugs. That would be my general guess, because I certainly haven't studied it.
With exceptions. But so I'm imagining, knowing you and that we worked at Morgan Stanley together, you're a free market guy and believe that on some level, and I agree that enterprise actually can be quite innovative and help people and help society. This may be a big exception. But what do we think about pharmaceutical companies advertising every friggin' drug in the world on every sports show, okay, what do we think of cereal companies advertising to children in the morning? And one of the things I have to wrestle with as I'm writing about this, I'm trying to figure out, like, what is a public policy? What should public policy look like? And how far can we go and how far should we go? I remember Michael Bloomberg, when he was mayor, he tried to regulate the sale of 16-ounce sodas, and he was run out of town. You would have thought you're taking people's, religion away. And it's really hard part of that is commercial, and part of that is our sense of personal freedom. When they started banning smoking in restaurants, That was wildly unpopular. And now it's normal.
It is normal. And you know, the first thing, the libertarian in me says, you have to disclose what the problems are and allow companies to do what they will so that people have the free choice to do what they want.
Right.
And I don't know to what extent the labeling on cigarettes made inroads, but I do know that once the public policy moved, right, I think it's probably pretty big. And then and it probably laid the groundwork for the later political acceptance of banning it indoors and moving it to where it's gotten.
We had a national campaign to educate the public about the dangers of smoking. It was warnings, it was taxes, it was banning it in certain places, it was studying secondary smoke. And so, and this is global. Also, I think people here do realize everyone follows the United States, not perfectly, but the dietary guidelines for people with diabetes that are set by the American Diabetes Association affect how people with diabetes in Morocco or Sweden eat. I mean, we are the leaders. And as we were with smoking, now, if you go to many countries, people smoke more than they smoke here. It's not lockstep, but it is consistent. So in case of sugar or diabetes, where now we have, it's a global disaster in emerging countries like India and China, it's like this. Because what are they doing? They're adopting the Western diet. And that's, nice sugar and ice cream and seed oils, and people can debate those. So I do think that, and frankly, when I talk to advocates, low carb advocates, they don't have good answers about what we should do.
Yeah, it's not simple. It's not simple. Now that pharmaceutical companies represent over half of the advertising on a lot of programs, and you can certainly see it anecdotally.
Yep.
It just seems too much. Whether they should be allowed to advertise at all, which most other countries ban, I think there are only two other countries that don't ban it.
Is that true? Pharmaceutical. And why do you think?
I can't say that it is true. I can say that I've heard it.
Fair. I understand. But why do you?
And I know it was banned in our country for a long time, and then there was a court case, and it was overruled, and it was deemed that pharmaceutical companies should be able to talk, as long as they're following the advertising rules of not misrepresenting and disclosing the problems that a drug can bring, which they do.
Right.
That they should have the right to advertise. Part of the problem is that the system has gotten so bloated and so expensive that they're making such a disproportionate amount of economic rent off of these drugs. That's probably a distortion that they can afford to advertise more.
Yep.
Than
it's crazy.
Companies.
I've tried to understand insulin pricing. For an example, we all know intuitively that insulin is very expensive. If you have type 1, you need it, and you die without it, and people go broke and they don't get their insulin. You also kind of know that under the Inflation Reduction Act, monthly insulin for people on Medicare is capped at $30. That sounds all pretty straightforward. It ain't, because who's paying? Are the PBMs, which you know about because you are Wall Street maven, the pharmaceutical benefit managers, are they subsidizing other drugs? Are they increasing the price on other drugs when the price of insulin goes down? How come everyone can't get it's so complicated, and maybe intentionally, but I'm also trying to understand that. And as you probably know, insulin was one of the greatest medical discoveries of the 20th century. Scientists in the University of Toronto came up with it and until then, people with type 1 diabetes died because they couldn't manufacture insulin. And they said, this is for the world, this is not for us. And they sold it to a company called Eli Lilly for $1 to mass produce it because they did not want to profit from it. And in the old days, that was normal for medical research. And we know what happened. Eli Lilly and Novartis and I'll think of this third one, have global monopolies, and they were, price went up tenfold in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's all messed up. And I'm not an expert. So I know that, I'm here talking to you. I'm learning. I'm a student, and I plan to write about it. Because
it's a natural twin in many ways of the prison problem, where we had good intentions. It was a pretty good setup as it started, and then there were distortions that occurred along the way that caused it to get outsized relative to what we could determine by observation around the world is a kind of a normalized amount. And the same thing with the healthcare system. We're way beyond what is a normalized amount of cost to our society of what the healthcare system should be providing, especially given the results.
Yeah, I think the way I would make the comparison is that each of them are I would say disasters that we become inured to, especially healthcare. I mean, criminal justice also. Like we just understood that people were over incarcerated, but let's take healthcare. It is an article of faith that we have we have an obesity epidemic. You could look pictures of Coney Island in the 20s and 50s and 60s, and people weren't overweight, and now they are. And it is an art, and we just accept that. And we accept, well, that's the major one, but also the rate of death, as I said, of people with diabetes and other chronic illnesses. And why isn't this a matter? Why isn't there a national commission studying like our obesity epidemic? You could save millions of lives, not to mention the money. And so, yes, it's controversial, and yes, the sugar companies will fight with the wheat company. Farmers will fight with the beef, will fight with the, but still, it is so damaging to the lives of average Americans. And so that we have this tolerance. If something, it's like the boiling the frog, if something creeps up on us, we have a tolerance, whereas like COVID or the AIDS epidemic, I mean, that came and it was like lightning and you had to address it. But obesity is every bit or more damaging, but we didn't just wake up with it. It crept up on us. And you add the financial forces, and then you add the complexity of the science, and it kind of has immobilized us, I feel, as a society.
I think so. I think also the old motto of follow the money would lead you to be able to hypothesize that there are a lot of well-endowed players that are definitely not going to benefit from an exposure of the truth. And that's why you don't have commissions probably. And that's why you have to go to YouTube that is loaded with people that are uncovering truths.
But also untruths. I mean, again, nutrition is the perfect example where you are watching a civil war and you don't know. I mean, I have my go-to people who are science researchers, and I like to think that they're credible. But you could find Harvard doctors who are tenured professors at Harvard Medical School who've each published 25 books, who have diametrically opposing views of why we get fat. One group says it's the carbs in, calories in, calories out. That calories is unit of energy, and if you expend more energy than you consume, then you don't gain weight. If you consume more than you expend, you gain weight. Okay. The other school is the carbohydrate insulin model, which says that a calorie is not a calorie, that the body metabolizes certain calories different than others, and that it's the anyway. These are just diametrically opposed scientific views. And by the way, you can't say, well, this guy's from Harvard, he must know what he's talking about, because they're both from Harvard.
All true.
Disagree.
All true. But that is the beauty of having all of a plethora of opposing opinions, is that it is much better to have all these people.
As long as they're intellectually honest.
Exactly.
And they're not getting their money from Philip Morris or Coca-Cola.
Exactly. You want to find out, follow the money, if we want to find out if there are sponsorships involved in any of these experts giving their opinions, just like the American Diabetes Association. You want to find out, there's an expert organization.
Exactly.
What is it that may be tilting their views? One thing that I've heard is Monsanto was amazingly good at preventing studies that they didn't. They provided the funding for so many of the studies that the other studies didn't get funded and didn't get the didn't get exposed.
On the carcinogenic elements of the fertilizer, or what was it called?
Roundup.
Roundup, yeah. Listen, okay, so I'm going to throw a question at you now because you're a Wall Street guy and you're a free enterprise guy. And I used to run a hedge fund. I managed money on behalf of institutions and high net worth individuals. And when I was running a hedge fund, I would invest in any company I thought would make money. I felt my job was to make money for my investors. I don't want to seem sanctimonious. I invested in tobacco stocks. I think I would, and etc. And now I'm older. I'm retired, and I'm thinking, wow, was that the right thing? What is the obligation of the private sector in this whole battle? Because I look at my hero, Warren Buffett, who's owned Coca-Cola and Kraft and Dairy Queen and See's Candy. All these are the most diabetes creating and at best and obesity. And so now I'm confused. And does he deserve our opprobrium, our criticism, or is he doing what's legal and he's working on behalf of his shareholders? And we live in a capitalist society, and it's up to our government to regulate, and he should do whatever he feels is best for his company. Throw it back to you.
I've got the cop-out answer, and that is you let freedom of speech and you let the marketplace determine all of this. And there are terrific movements that have put huge weights on some of the companies over time that have been producing goods that are not good for society. And you have to kind of let that play out. And I think you need to be on the alert for the concentrations of wealth that cause distortions in the ability for some to suppress speech and suppress discovery and suppress truth. And then you have to take action. And my guess is that our laws right now, social media is a great example right now. People are saying that these are monopolies on the technical grounds of what the law says a monopoly is, which is something that attacks the consumer, where the consumer is getting hurt. It's not clear that the consumer is getting hurt by Google's dominance in search. It's companies are having to pay up for advertising on their platform if they're the true customer.
I agree.
And so so I'm not sure the laws can keep up in real time with the concentrations of this wealth that we're talking about. But I do think that the system needs to be flexible, and that flexibility depends on the ability for truth to get out. And that's what I had a conversation the other day with Alex Gladstein, who's the head of the Human Rights Foundation, and his whole mission is to help dissidents under authoritarian regimes. He doesn't consider the United States authoritarian because we have this ability to dissent, and it's not illegal for people to stand in the square and denounce their leadership.
Right.
Thank God. And I think that's you have to protect all of those rights.
But I'm going to put it in another way to you. You're an asset manager. I think you ran money, or you were certainly close enough to it.
Yeah, close enough, but never actually ran money.
But you had friends who did, like me. Let's say I was running my fund again. Now I'm this fire and brimstone guy, and I'm all upset with the pharmaceutical companies and the food companies. You know what? They're very profitable. They have very high margins. They have very strong brands, blah, blah, blah. What am I supposed to do?
You create things that either respond to customer needs or anticipate customer needs. And I think the ESG movement was that. There was a very large amount of money, and it grew very quickly, that was devoted to making investments only in companies that had a score on the ESG measure that's high enough.
I'm considering, because now I consider myself going back to journalism, and I do feel this is something I want to write about, specifically with Buffett, because I consider Buffett to be a highly ethical person, a highly effective he's the best argument for capitalism. A lot of people are arguments against capitalism, but he's the best argument for capitalism I know. And yet, such a high percent of his wealth is based on investing in things that I consider bad for people's health. And you know who else considers it bad for people's health? He does. He understands now. I guarantee you he's not still sipping Coke, 5 Cokes a day. Anyway, it's just interesting. I don't claim to have the answer. And because I live in a glass house, I definitely feel when I was a professional manager, I certainly didn't give up or sacrifice opportunities because I thought these things. Now, would I invest in private prisons? I didn't. Would I have? I don't know. Payday lenders. There are certain businesses to me that are so offensive, but I guarantee you, I know we invested in tobacco, and they sell a lethal product. I mean, there's some easy ones. So I need to think about it.
Yeah, it's again, I think that if there is either a current investor base that would fund your operation,
Right.
whether it's an investment shop or
Right.
journalism
Yep.
venture, whatever, that either exists today or you're anticipating will be growing and existing tomorrow,
Yeah.
then this endeavor would meet with greater success than if you are misidentifying a customer base
Right.
or
But I'm
misunderstanding where
talking
the future
about
is
my
going.
conscience. But you're saying, well, dude, your conscience goes so far. But if you're if you're going to sacrifice 500 basis points of return, you're going to lose your investors unless
Exactly.
you can explain to them what you're doing and they're prepared to take that hit.
Said better than what I was saying. That's right.
And I guarantee you, many will say they are, but they're not. So that's the other problem.
Well, that's the anti-benevolent core of the human nature that we were talking
people
about.
will say, well, we can do this and there's no sacrifice because if you invest in companies that are good for the environment, they do better. And there's this virtuous cycle, but there's not. Cigarettes are very profitable. I mean, that's the best example. Or pollutants are very profitable, can be, so it's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. I think, the chemical companies might even be an easier description. Certainly, many decades ago when they were polluting everything everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there were movements and it rallied political support and increased regulation. And today we're in a much better,
more regulated.
Yeah, there are fewer obvious polluted areas.
Yep.
But yeah, back to the beginning of our conversation, you said there's basically a benevolent core of humanity. I think that that's absolutely right. And that doesn't mean that you don't have all sorts of problems with certain individuals or certain incentive systems that individuals wind up within that cause problems that need to be solved. And I am very curious about whether our kids are going to be better off. I'm not sure how I would answer that survey. Are you confident your kids are going to be better off? I think I am, but we do have some monumental problems, and we may have to go through much worse times before they can enjoy that better society.
Yep. I'm 66. When I graduated college in the early 80s, I would have said, no, my generation is not going to do as well as my parents' generation. We were in a recession. It was shallow and short-lived. And yet I was wrong. And now the baby boomers are the most despised generation because we're so privileged. But I'm not worried about my kids per se, and I'm not kidding, but I feel that democracy, and I don't want to go too far down this lane, as being stressed like no time in my life, not just here, but everywhere. And that is extremely concerning.
I think that statement is one that would get broad agreement in a survey.
Yeah.
And ironically, for different reasons on each side of the political spectrum, because you're hearing it from both sides, and they both have their reasons that are pretty legitimate. They're very legitimate. And so
okay. All right. This is great.
It is great. It's so good to see you again, Neil.
Well, it's great to catch up with you at a very, very high level. I mean, I'm not used to having these casual conversations with my friends, but I think what you're doing is great. I've seen some of the other interviews you've had, and I really feel that your own endeavor is an act of faith, because your act of faith is that there's an audience of people who are interested in engaging on a sophisticated level, non-ideological problem solving, and not a clickbait sort of thing. And so I applaud you for doing that. And really, you know, I'm complimenting the viewer
Thank
because
you.
they're so smart and well, but it's true. There are a lot of ways we can go in life, and what you're trying to do is elevate a conversation. So I applaud you and hope you do great.
Thank you very, very much. And I really hope you do great, because you're doing
Do
much
my best.
more. And you know, let me know if there's anything I can do to help too, because the healthcare system needs a lot of light shined on it.
Well, if your viewers have any comments to make about diabetes, about amputations, which is what I'm doing, I want to talk to people. I mean, this isn't the time or place.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say is,
I'm
how can we
interested.
contact you?
Well, thank you for that, because I do like to interact with people, particularly as I'm learning more and more about diabetes, and I'm looking into, as I said, amputations, amputees. I guess the best way would be on Twitter, X, on at NS Barsky, Barsky is the best way. Responsive and grateful for anyone who wants to reach out.
Terrific. Neil, have a great weekend.
Thank
Great
you,
to
my
see you.
friend. Take good care.